Welcome to Enemies from War to Wisdom. Why do we need enemies? From intimate relationships to politics, tribalism, and community, we cannot seem to stop dehumanizing each other. Chronic conflicts in our families, societies, and nations seem inevitable. In this podcast, we analyze human hostilities from the most mundane to the most sophisticated. We apply psychology, psychoanalysis, art, spirituality, and relational theory in conversation about belonging and otherness. Each program will reach for a fresh wisdom that shows us how to step back from creating enemies in our lives. I'm your host, Eleanor Johnson, a videographer and artist with Emma Troupe, an experimental theater group in New York City, and I am here with my co-host, Paula Young-Eisendrath, who is a psychologist, Jungian analyst, author, and speaker. We approach our ideas each from our own worlds, but always from the spirit and teaching of Buddhism, of which we are lifelong practitioners.
This is Gary Jevitt, and I will be joining our host, Paula Young-Eisendrath, and Eleanor Johnson for part 2 of a discussion about the fear of death. But you have no fear, or you fear it?
I don't have fear. No, I mean, I don't think that I'm not going to hurt or suffer or cry or be uncomfortable or any of that. But I don't have any fear. No, I don't. I have fear that I might not meet the challenges of being a better human being in this lifetime. That's very important to me. How I live this lifetime determines my relationship to death and consciousness.
To the end of that striving.
Right. That's just how it's been for me my entire life, and that consciousness is the ultimate ground of all being, and everything is consciousness.
Well, it turns out from what Gary was saying, all of us will go through a life review. It appears.
Yes. Whether you're a Buddhist or a Christian or a Jew or a Native American.
We haven't actually talked about this life review.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to talk about it now because I wanted to talk first about, what is death, why we should or shouldn't fear it, and what it offers us as an opportunity for development.
Because the fear is in that life review. Because if you've not lived a noble life or a good life or a kind life, or you've lived through selfishness and greed and violence and you've hurt other people, then you're going to have a harder time in your life review than if you've not. I mean, from my point of view, that's very personal.
Right.
Well, there's now scientific information, quite a lot on the life review, which makes it a very specific thing, different from maybe what we thought. It's not like a review of your narrative, but from what they're finding, what happens like in our day-to-day existence, we exist in this snow globe or this kind of bubble, and there are other familiar people in here, like there's an Eleanor, there's a Gary. I mean, Chris comes and goes. I don't really know Chris that well. But so the people that are in your bubble with you, when you go through the life review, you experience their thoughts and feelings and pain and so on that you created, or their joy and happiness and expansiveness that you created. So this very encapsulated life review, because it's happening outside of space-time, may seem to be only 3 seconds long, but it's comprehensive of all of the ways your speech and actions have affected people around you, not only people, but animals and so on. And so you jump into, your consciousness is never just located in yourself. It's never located just in your bag of skin.
Well, that's a very important piece to understand.
Right. Well, we're understanding it.
The Book of the Dead opens that up in a very, very detailed way.
Yes, although I have to say it doesn't give as precise information as
it was written
a
while. It was written at it was from another time.
I'm not criticizing it. I'm simply saying that I think we need to be aware that the evidence that wonderful spiritual practitioners have brought everyone from Jesus to Tibetan masters about what happens after death, that evidence has been anecdotal. And so it's been the bubble telling this is, so now we've got a lot of bubbles telling us. We have a lot of evidence. And one of the big things that's coming out that is, I think, extremely important is understanding what life review is and how close it sounds to what the Buddhists teach about karma.
Would it well, speaking personally, knowing that there is or isn't a life review would not necessarily affect my fear or not fear per se, but it would be a landmark if I know that I'm expecting it.
Yeah. And you might, clean up your act. I mean,
that's right.
People, are affecting each other by their intentional actions.
Right.
I mean, so in the teaching in Buddhism is that your intentional actions are leading constantly to the construction of your life, not in a way that if you're good, you're going to get everything you want. It's not like that at all. But what you're creating dynamically between you and other people is what you are experiencing, and in the life review you experience from all of the different points of view the effects of your actions on other consciousnesses.
Well, again, the coherence between self and other, the consciousness.
They're never separated.
Yes, between you and the other, exchanging self for other, to have that relationship to the other changes the whole narrative.
Well, yeah,
because
does.
we live
really
so self-contained, and it's all the I, and you're separated. But when you're not separated from the other,
well, let's say,
plays a very different, just changes things dramatically.
Well, let's say in this period of time, 20th century, 21st century, we've been very materialistic, very greedy, very oriented towards
very selfish.
What can I accumulate for myself? So there are people with grotesque wealth who seem to be feted by the media, as though this is a good thing. To have all of
Divine right of kings,
these yachts and these airplanes and these palaces and so on. As it turns out, it could be that those things are fairly disruptive when you recognize that all the people you might have hurt or harmed to get that. And then you're going to do your life review. So when does your life review occur? It occurs after typically the brain has flatlined. So it's occurring in that realm of, let's say, consciousness without the body. So your consciousness can move around
or at least
feel
without brain activity.
Without the brain activity, yeah. And so that's occurring if you're going to die, like if it's not a near-death experience where you're going to come back. If you're going to die, it's occurring right before that moment of death.
Before the consciousness departs the body.
Before the consciousness departs. So, you're going to be thrown heavily by the karma that you've created. And then you're not paying attention when you enter that next dimension, which, by Buddhist standards is called the rebirth dimension, the dharmata, the movement from the death moment into the rebirth moment.
The bardo
of rebirth. So you're thrown by your karma from this lifetime heavily at the moment when you need to pay attention. So it's a very good way of really clarifying.
I grew up with
why this stuff is, not good.
I grew up with a mother, a very devout Roman Catholic mother, who always said when anything went wrong or there was violence or greed or terrible things happening, she would always say to us, they're going to burn in hell, or they're going to get theirs later. They might not get it while they're alive, but once they die, they're going to get it. There's no way around. There's no escape. And she just always talked about that all through our childhood. It's very Catholic talk.
Catholic karma.
Yeah, Catholic karma.
Yeah.
But that awareness, even when I was taking my mother through her dying process at the end of her life when she was in the hospital dying, she then, given everything, all the changes that were going on in the world, and she hated Trump and all of this stuff, she just took comfort in that. She took comfort that it would all get handled. They'd all go to hell. she found peace in that. And I watched that in my mother, and it was medieval in a certain way, but also it gave her great comfort.
Well, again, it's a probably more subtle process.
Sure.
I had the same kind of mother.
Sure.
But from a Buddhist perspective, anytime you hate,
exactly,
you're creating more hatred.
Exactly.
And so then that gets you back into the issue of your actions
Cycles.
moving in a direction that will return you to hatred. But, because, again, this information about life review is much more subtle than you're going to hell.
But it occurs to me to ask about life review. So I'm having my life review, and I'm revisiting all of these moments when I caused others happiness or unhappiness.
Right.
And I'm curious, so if I'm a capitalist, I may have hurt people in other countries that I've never seen, by my mining activities or something, or drilling oils and all that sort of stuff, or war. But how far will my experience of their subjectivity extend? Will it be people I really had a one-on-one relationship with, or will it extend beyond?
Well, the Dalai Lama says it goes way back.
Well, let me just say that I don't think we know.
Yeah.
But what the Buddha taught was it was your immediate bhavanga. It was the ones that were in your day-to-day life that you're most affecting, because they're essentially not separate from you. So all of your actions with them are counting much more than the people on the other side of the world. However, if you look at this research that's going on now, beyond space-time, Don Hoffman stuff, or you think about let's say the mind of God being infinite subjectivity. So within the mind of God, all subjectivity is connected. And so then what you do to the subjectivity within your framework does have repercussions all the way out through the mind of God, if you want to call it that.
Much as it can within the materialist realm.
Yes, it can in the materials. It reverberates there too.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of your karma, the way that you experience, like how does the Gary consciousness experience what Gary did, positive, negative, in the life review. From what I've seen of the research on it, it's the immediate people that you've affected. And of course, the case that Bruce Grayson talks about that is so incredibly illustrative is a man who, was dead as the result of a car falling on him, and then they resuscitated him eventually. And he in his life review, reviewed a moment where he punched somebody 32 times, and he didn't know why that person was drunk and accosting him. But when he did the life review, he was inside of that person. That person's wife had just died. He was drinking because his wife had just died. And then he felt the blows of the 32. He was able to count them in the life review. The times that he punched the guy, he could feel the pain in his face. He could feel all of that. And he could also feel himself doing it. So it was in the immediate environment.
Right.
And in this case, he justified it because the guy cursed at him, walked in front of his truck. So he justified his jumping out and hitting the guy because the guy had assaulted him. But what he did to the guy was way worse than what the guy had done to him. And so, I don't know how all the algebra of all that works out, but I think it's a good idea to start to pay attention to how you treat the people around you.
Well, that's mindfulness.
That's mindfulness. But, and then the compassion towards them.
Well, you underscore it, put quotes around it.
Right, because you're going to be in them.
Put it in neon.
You're going to be in them.
It helps.
When you're before your moment. So there, if you follow these trends, which are coming from near-death studies, reincarnation studies, the beyond space-time, all of that, if you follow those trends along with whatever spiritual trends you might plug into, your fear of death should be about fearing how you may create suffering in your everyday life for others as well as yourself, but you experience your own suffering. You may burn off that karma, but the way that others may suffer as a result of your lack of consideration, kindness, truth with others, that you would begin to really look at your life carefully, and that's where life and death are not separated. They're always together. And this idea that Ibn Alexander talks about, that we travel through lifetimes with what he calls a soul group. The Tibetans also call it, it's a sort of group of beings that you're refining your consciousness with from lifetime to lifetime. You rotate around in identifications, but you're learning with that group. You're not inside of your body. You're not just in your bag of skin as a consciousness, but you're responsible for how that consciousness acts.
Also, within the technology of spirituality, you have forgiveness, you have purification. That also plays a role in all of this. It's, I guess in one way you could say you have to be very awake to be able to participate on that level. But that's interesting to me, that particular role of purification and transmuting karma and forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, in an ordinary, everyday way,
It affects,
apologies,
it affects
reparations,
the consciousness.
all of those things will also affect the ongoing development of what you are reaping and sowing. So there's always forgiveness, there's always repair, there's always apologies. And then, within spiritual practices, you can go to higher realms to ask for forgiveness. Like you can ask from the gods or from God, or you can ask for forgiveness from others, humans. And then in the Buddhist world, there are 31 realms. So you have bodhisattvas, you have a lot of beings that can be forgiving. But even though the Buddha was enlightened, he still had karma that he was paying off in his lifetime. And, he had karma.
That may be the mechanism.
He had karma he was paying off with, he left his wife.
Yeah.
He left his son.
I mean, that may be it. I mean, that might be the nature of it.
I think it is. I think it's the nature of space-time and the universe.
Yeah, that's how we're evolving and we're becoming stardust again or something. I don't know, but I think that just
what are we evolving to?
Yeah.
Where does it go?
I mean, I do believe, it's just personal for me, but I do believe it, and it gives me a certain kind of quality in my life that it's all the degree to which we can wake up and do this consciously participate in this way, that it's growing the universe, that it's a benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that fits with the new science.
Yeah,
This kind of new science of consciousness is that the universe is being generated by conscious beings. Right. And so we're conscious beings generating it. And that's more or less what the Buddha said too. Right. I mean, as it turns out, he said, within this body, we generate the world, the arising of the world, and the ceasing of the world. And so we're generating it through our intentional actions, our speech, and the way those affect this consciousness that's flowing from lifetime to lifetime.
Yeah, consciousness emerging from consciousness.
Yeah.
In a never-ending cycle.
Right, exactly.
And then you realize, too, how dangerous the kind of materialistic view that you were talking about in the opening of our dialogue is to all of this.
Yes.
I mean, it's a terrible danger.
Well, let's say it's a sad product of human
ignorance.
Minds, or ignorance, yeah. I mean, in a way I can understand it, how it evolved from...
Well, you would, because you're a psychologist.
Well, also, I mean, I would say I'm a scientist,
Oh, yeah.
Developmental psychologist. But, so humans were asking questions, about how do we study this world? And so a lot of beings in Europe started separating out the objects so they can study them. And it starts with the Greeks, really. We're trying to find something that's eternal here. So let's look for an atom. Let's look for the smallest unit. And so more and more that develops, you start separating subject and object. And then we become a world in the West where we're studying the object, the world, from our subjectivity, but we assume that they're split apart. So then we start acting on the object.
That existence is saturated with separation.
Separation. It's the separation paradigm. And then the ultimate of the separation paradigm, I'm going to say, is mid-20th century. It's not that we're out of it yet.
The 50s?
The 50s, right after World War II, because there was a loss of belief in this bigger picture. It was like, if God existed, the Holocaust would not have happened. But I think that's a mistake to think that way. Because human beings create human environments. It's not God. Right. And so human beings acted in ways that were so delusional and distorted, believing an authority who said, I'm going to purify, or we're going to purify the races. But then, that idea of purifying comes around again. We're in a time of contagion. And there was all of this anxiety about contagion that is fairly recent, with the idea that we can eliminate viruses, or we can purify ourselves of viruses. Why would we want to do that?
Or have a perfect screen of protection against them.
Yeah, and so why would we want to do that? Like, let's talk for a moment about what happened with COVID-19. I don't want to get into anything about the medical science of it, because that's not our wheelhouse. But, what do you see about people's behavior? How did people start behaving with each other as people?
As the
humans?
threat level rose, their thinking became increasingly, I want to say, limited.
Well, I think there was extraordinary manipulation going on that confused people. They didn't know what to believe. I mean, authorities who were very important in their life were telling them one thing, somebody else was telling them something else, and this massive kind of chaotic confusion took over.
There was so much...
And media and all these different voices. You had like 100 voices speaking at the same time, and nobody was hearing each other, and there was so much fear being created, and nobody could hear each other. Everybody was trying to find sides.
Part of it seemed to be that the people I know that are the most thinking and intelligent, they would try to follow up all of this information and reconcile it, and it would make them crazy.
Right. Or we became pariahs in a sense, because we were doing the research and we were questioning.
Yeah.
And we were risking doing all kinds of things.
So let me say that most people put on masks and social distance. I'm just sort of getting to the facts of it. Mm-hmm. And when you're putting on the mask and you're social distancing, you look upon your fellow human being as somebody who's contagious.
A threat.
That's the way it looks. Because in the past, people wore masks only when they were contagious. Like if you were in Asia, you'd see people wearing masks. It's only because they're contagious, not because they're well wearing a mask. So the signaling that was out there across the board was to look upon your fellow person as a contagious unit that you need to get away from. And there was no way to say to your fellow person, I'm well. And I saw this again and again, because people would say, how do you know you're well? Well, first of all, I'm not sick. I know when I'm sick. I know when I'm not sick. Oh, but you could be carrying some contagion. Well, I could be carrying contagion anytime about anything. Like, why at this moment is this a special issue? And it's because you can't say you're well. In the past, you could say, well, I quarantined for 14 days, so I must be well. Now you've quarantined for 14 days, but you can't say you're well. So everybody is a potential contagion. So everyone looks upon other people that are outside of their social bubble as a potential threat. So you don't any longer relate to people in a kind way or in a courteous way. You move away from them, or you say, in the midst of a lot of this, people would say, step back, get out of my space, don't reach, don't talk. And so that created a very different, very unkind feeling about being around other people. Mm-hmm. And as you say, there was a huge amount of confusion, because a lot of people thought that was kindness.
Well, it was
to
also
act like
coming
that.
From an authority that, people were trying to follow the rules. And then it just got so complicated in people's personal lives. They were trying to do what they were told, put on a mask. If you don't put on a mask, you can't come here. Or, all of that. And the different stages we went through before we had the vaccines or, ways of testing.
Well, we know now that the illness wasn't treated in its early stages.
No,
and
not
so
at
it should
all.
have been.
I know.
And because
our medical system is
well, we were
broken.
Apparently set up in order to buy a lot of vaccines, and that was the setup. But be that as it may, a lot of ordinary people bought into the paradigm. And I think that one reason why ordinary people buy into paradigms that are destructive to humans is they're afraid of dying. And that fear of dying promotes a sort of small-mindedness.
A narrow-mindedness.
At a moment.
Narrow.
Very narrow.
Yeah, at a moment.
It closes you down.
When you're scared. So you're getting scared
That's
about.
a good point, Polly.
You're just looking for there's one or two things that will keep you alive, and you're not interested in.
And you might not even be aware that you're doing it. Like this unconscious force comes out of that fear, comes up for people.
So I think that if we can shift this paradigm around death,
Right.
if people can begin to recognize the continuity of consciousness, whether you have a spiritual practice or not, the
Right.
science around this is very strong. And so if they can begin to recognize that the way they live their everyday life is not just, sort of like the way Kubler-Ross said, the way you live is going to be the way you die,
Exactly.
which I think is accurate, but it's not just that. It's what you create with the others that are close to you, that you are going to experience when you're dying,
Right.
and that's going to throw you this way or that way.
And that also brings up the whole relationship each one of us has to our own sense of responsibility and accountability.
Well,
and how we live our lives.
So your life is never separated from your death.
Right, exactly.
And so if you recognize how it's connected, then you might get a very precise guideline.
It's helpful.
For how to live your life so that you're not so thrown in your death that you're thrown into something that is very painful and frightening.
Right.
And I think the more we're able to precisely understand, and I believe we are on the road to precisely understanding.
I think we are as well.
What happens at the time of death and after death, the more we understand that, the more I believe we will find that we have to be a human species. We have to understand the kind of consciousness that is human, and we have to understand how to help it thrive.
Right.
And that there are other kinds of consciousnesses, but one thing that is true about the human is that we can be aware of our awareness. We can become mindful of our own behaviors. We can change right in midstream. We can do something a dog can't do. We can do something a cockroach can't do. There are a lot of things that dogs and cockroaches do that we can't do. They're probably more in a unitary consciousness than we are.
I sometimes think too, to just really kind of be as present as I can with the fact that I am a Homo sapien who aspires to be a better human being.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That I don't just assume that I am a human being, but I do assume I'm a Homo sapien, but that I aspire to be a better human being.
Well, you can become human.
You can work.
In a lifetime, a single lifetime, you can learn what it means to be human. You can learn to care for humans. If you can learn to work with conflict.
Right.
If you cannot learn to work with conflict, you're going to be destructive. There's just no question about it.
Gee, that's a whole other podcast.
Well, we have done a lot of those.
Well, we have, haven't
we?
Thanks so much for listening. And to continue the conversation, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find past episodes of the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Castbox. Enemies from War to Wisdom is recorded and produced by Chris Coltrane.